Okay, hi everybody. Today's lesson is going to be on PTSD. And so I've done what I usually do in live classes, which is to just write on a dry erase board so you could follow along. So as I said, today's topic is PTSD. And so feel free to pause the video, obviously, if you need to write things down. And I will also be pausing too so that you know when to write them down. So PTSD stands for post-traumatic. T is for traumatic, S is for stress, D is for disorder. So in other words, this is a condition that occurs after a trauma, so post-traumatic, and it's got a lot of stress symptoms. Now, we all have stress, but this is going to be an amount of stress that's going to qualify as being very difficult to handle. So that's why they're calling it a disorder. Now, the first thing that you need for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is why I have the diagnostic criteria here. The diagnostic criteria is basically saying the same thing as symptoms, which we had gone through in class, that SX stands for symptoms, or short for symptoms. So this is how you would know if you meet criteria for PTSD. Again, you really shouldn't be diagnosing yourself based on this video, but you need to speak to a professional. But I'm going to go through the diagnostic criteria for PTSD just so that you have it and you're familiar with what it entails. Okay, so they call the symptoms in the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, they call the symptoms criteria. So criterion A is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Okay, so it's exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Now, DSM has recently changed and stated that they've recently added that this is a direct exposure. It's an event that actually happened to you, and that it's not an event that you experience through the media or through television. So that's a criterion A trauma. One of the things to consider when you're interviewing somebody or you're thinking about yourself is whether or not what happened to you meets this criterion. So for example, if I ask somebody, I'm a clinical psychologist, if I ask somebody, have you had a traumatic experience in your life? Sometimes they'll say something like, well, my cat died. And so your cat dying is definitely traumatic. And some people, upon hearing that, might think, okay, it's traumatic, but it's not going to be criterion A trauma. But what I suggest that you do when you're thinking about any trauma that you hear about is to go deeper and to ask, how did the cat die? Okay, there are ways that an animal could die, a pet could die, that would meet criterion A trauma. So if it was very unusual, or if you feel that somehow you were at fault, or that somehow you killed the animal accidentally, that could meet characteristics for criterion A trauma. So again, when you're interviewing or you're thinking about people, don't dismiss their trauma until you talk about it much more thoroughly. Now, criterion B is one or more, so this is my own little shorthand, is one or more intrusive symptoms. So intrusion symptoms, meaning that these are things that come upon you that you do not want to happen. Okay, you're sitting there minding your own business, and all of a sudden that memory comes back of that horrible thing that happened to you. Okay, it's not that you're pondering it, it's not that you're reminiscing about it. It comes and it sort of feels like an attack. It attacks you in the middle of you wanting to do something else. So criterion B, one or more intrusive symptoms, okay, that can be met by intrusive memories. Okay, so again, you're not reminiscing. This is something that comes to you when you're feeling like you want to be doing something else, and then all of a sudden this memory of this horrible thing comes back to you, and it's intruding on your life. Number 2, intrusive dreams. Okay, so these could be nightmares of the trauma, or if it's not about the trauma, you know or feel that there's strong symbolism in the dream, and that what's in the dream symbolizes your trauma. A lot of children will have dreams that are, well, I don't want to say a lot of children will have dreams that are like this, but if a child has PTSD, it could be that their dreams will come out as like a monster chasing them. And so that's not, it might not look like it's related because the person who did something to them isn't in the dream, but there's some symbolism there. So, and again, if your child has dreams about trauma, that does, or has dreams about monsters, that does not mean that they have PTSD or that anything necessarily happened to them. But when we're looking for PTSD, that is one of the symptoms that we're looking at if the child picks, has all these other symptoms as well. Okay, and it is a little different in children. Number 3 is flashbacks, right? So intrusive flashbacks. Again, you're not trying to reminisce or trying to share stories, or this is something that you're sitting in the middle of class or sitting, at home watching TV, and all of a sudden you feel like this event is happening again. And a lot of times the flashbacks are accompanied by sensory experiences also. So you feel like you can see things are happening, you can smell the way things were when the traumatic event was happening, you might hear things that were happening. So that would be flashbacks. Distress at reminders. So you get very, very upset by things that remind you of the event. And then we have another group of symptoms, which is avoidance, right? So avoidance, you avoid conversations, you avoid people and places. So an example of avoidance is somebody who, let's say somebody's, for an example, somebody's mother got killed on the sidewalk as they were walking down the street, accidentally got hit by a car. So now the person completely avoids sidewalks. Okay, but let's say the person lives in Queens, New York, where there's a lot of traffic on the street. They don't care. They would walk on the street to avoid walking on the sidewalk. So that's an example of avoidance, and it also meets the criteria for abnormal behavior that we talked about early in the semester, where we said that this was going to be dysfunctional, or it was going to be harmful to the person who has it. So that's avoidance. Okay, they avoid conversations. I also wanted to make a distinction. There are many people who have gone through trauma who get through it completely fine. They get through it stronger, and they might want to talk about it, and they might want to share it, and they go out there and they really become a voice for the experience that happened to them. And that doesn't meet criteria for PTSD, because part of this is avoiding the conversation, right? So you just don't want to talk about it. You're not ready. You don't want to deal with it. And that's not making any kind of judgments. It's just saying that they're in a different place with what happened to them at the moment. So that's avoidance criteria. We also have our D set, criterion D. Negative changes in cognition and mood. Okay, so criterion D, or symptom D, is negative changes in cognition and mood. So normally in class I would give you time to write this down, but you have a pause button, so I would use that. Okay, and so the first symptom under negative changes in cognition and mood is that they can't remember aspects of a trauma, and this is common in people with PTSD. So they can't remember, and it just has to do with a cognitive alteration. If you are going through a traumatic experience, your brain might want to handle it by just blocking it out. So if you block it out so that you don't have to deal with everything that's happening because it's really horrible, you might not be able to remember it. Okay. Now, this is not to be used as a way to say something didn't happen. So some people say, well, if you went through that experience, why can't you remember what the person looked like? Well, we know as psychologists that is a response that can happen. You don't remember what the person looks like because it was so traumatic that you blocked it out. So you can't remember aspects of the trauma. Number 2 is you have negative beliefs about yourself, the world, and others. Okay, so negative beliefs. And again, cognition means thought. And we did go through that earlier in the semester. You've got a negative change in cognition, negative change in the way you're thinking. So here, negative beliefs. This is an example of negative change in your cognition. So, for example, somebody might feel like, well, because this terrible thing happened to me, I have no future. Okay, and they didn't think that way before, so that represents a change. Or they might think, I'm ruined completely for my life, and I will never have a happy life, and I'm never going to get married, and no one will ever want me. Okay, so those are thoughts. And again, I would urge anyone who's thinking anything like that, please go to see a professional, because you can change those thoughts, because they're not true. They are an effect of something that you had gone through that you didn't want to go through. So again, see a professional so that you can start building your strength back. I've heard people say things like, I don't expect to live very long. I don't expect to live another year. I don't expect to get out of my teenage years. And again, it's an effect of what had happened to you that you didn't want to happen to you. So these are things we would like to change. So for the better. We'd like to strengthen people who've gone through PTSD. Who've gone through traumatic experience and are showing symptoms of PTSD. Criterion 6 is detachment or estrangement from others. Okay, so detachment or estrangement from others, even if you're at home, even if you're married, even if you've got your parents living with you, or you're living with roommates and you're living with family, you're still, or you could be totally alone and you just don't feel attached to anyone. You don't feel close to anyone, and you can't get close to someone. So that's also a criteria. Okay, another symptoms, can't experience love, happiness. Okay, so they can't experience love or happiness. It's just, again, they've been traumatized. So this is going to be something very, very difficult to feel. So they can't experience love and happiness, can't experience satisfaction either. Criterion E, okay, 2 or more of the following symptoms. So the first is irritable behavior. Okay, so they're always angry, or angry outbursts. Okay, so irritable behavior or angry outbursts. And this anger, it can be physical or verbal, those outbursts. So that would be a sign of criterion E, symptom 1. Okay. We also have criterion E, symptom 2, which is reckless or self-destructive behavior. So reckless or self-destructive behavior. So under this, we sometimes find people who drink a lot, or drink alcohol a lot, or abuse drugs. Again, a lot of abusing drugs is to escape pain. And also unsafe sexual behavior, again, also to escape pain. Or maybe they don't, people might not necessarily know why they're engaging in the behavior. They just might feel compelled to. Number 3 is hypervigilance. So hypervigilance means that you're always on the lookout. So vigilant from being on the lookout, and then hyper from being too much. So too much on the lookout. So you're scanning places for danger. When you're sitting in a restaurant, you don't want to sit with your back to the door because someone could come through the door and attack you. When you're sitting in class, you want to sit in the back so that you can see everybody. And maybe you're also planning, if someone were to come into this class, what would I do? If someone attacked me, who would I take out first? Okay, so those are the kinds of symptoms that we see sometimes. Number 4 is exaggerated startle response, which means that you startle easily. So there could be a loud noise that somebody else would be okay with, but you feel like hitting the floor, running for cover, running for safety. It's a lot, okay? When you hear a balloon pop, a car backfire, motorcycles go by, it just feels like it's too much. Because again, this is a stress response, right? So if you're already super stressed out, any little thing is going to push you over the edge. And in this case, a lot of the examples that we see are loud sounds. Number 5 is problems concentrating. So you could imagine that with all of these things going on, that you would have problems concentrating. Okay, so those are some of the things that we've gone through. We haven't gone through the entire list, but I think that gives you a good idea, a good picture of post-traumatic stress disorder. The only thing I wanted to add was that also the last criterion, which is criterion F, would be a sleep disturbance. So again, this is a stress disorder, and what's common in stress is that there's sleep disturbances. Another thing I'd like to add is that the duration of these symptoms is greater than 1 month. So if it's less than 1 month, we call it acute stress disorder. Acute meaning that it comes on and then it kind of goes away. But if it's going on for more than a month, then we're looking at PTSD. And then we also want to specify, like in your notes, you want to specify if the person that you're seeing who has PTSD, or if you have PTSD, you want to consider whether there's something called delayed expression. Delayed expression means that there's more than 6 months after the event. So if you don't show symptoms right away, you still might have PTSD if the symptoms show up 6 months later. And we have seen examples of people who they've gone through something and then they go through a car accident, and then that triggers the PTSD. My dog just came in. The PTSD from the other event. So in other words, you have an event, and then 6 months pass, and then there's a car accident or something that triggers PTSD from an earlier event. Okay, so it would still be related to the original event. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video. This is like my first full lecture. And email me any questions. Okay, thank you.